This is Radio 4, and now here's Feedback with Chris Dunkley.
Hello again. Dozens of listeners telephoned the BBC on Monday after John Humphreys, on the Today programme, interviewed Andrew Morton, author of the notorious new book about the Princess of Wales. The most common complaint, though only by a narrow margin, was that
this will simply help sales of the book.
Nearly as many people wanted to make the point expressed in a letter by Alison Miranda of Carr Bridge.
The BBC interviewer behaved like a schoolboy, jabbing and cornering, trying to force Morton into making the statements the interviewer wanted to hear. I wanted to hear what Morton had to say, not Humphreys' continual framing and reframing of the same question in the pathetic attempt to get some self-damning statement. In the little I did hear from Morton, he came over as a reasonable, sympathetic human being.
Mark Ashworth of Guildford says,
"Please ask John Humphreys if he could stop shouting down his interviewees."
That wasn't the only context in which the royal marriage saga featured. Miss P.C.F. Maidment of Charing Heath asks,
why is all the tut-tutting regarding reports on the Waleses' marriage and so on directed only at the press? For years the BBC has been ridiculing, belittling and being downright rude to the royal family almost every week in the week-ending programme. This constant sniping is possibly more harmful than one big news splash. Doubtless the programme will be airily dismissed as satire, the implication being that it's therefore perfectly acceptable. But last week's programme plumbed new depths. It was appalling, in extreme bad taste. How can the BBC broadcast programmes expressing concern about newspaper reports while transmitting this sort of material?
M. Hackett of Will Morton declares,
weekending was offensive, distasteful and boring, especially the cheap adolescent humorous content of the royal family sketches, particularly regarding the possible mental health of Princess Diana.
The royal marriage wasn't the only topical item to catch your attention. Margaret Bird of Stevenage.
Having read the enclosed newspaper article...
It's headed, Jenny Murray of Woman's Hour talking, marriage is an insult, women shouldn't touch it, as a bride I was a legal prostitute.
I wonder whether Jenny Murray doesn't sympathise with those of us who choose not to go out to work. Could some programmes, sometimes, somewhere, talk about things like flower arranging, care of houseplants, sewing and so on, as they used to?
Tim Grosvenor of West London, on the other hand, says,
I've become a fan of the programme. I'd go so far as to say that it is perhaps the most rounded programme on the radio. What strikes me as slightly peculiar is the notion that it's a woman's hour. I'm sure I'm not alone in being a male who finds the range of subjects, from science to health to ecology, generally absorbing. Because of the delightful combination of science and art, which some might suggest represents the concept of the universal man, person, perhaps the hour should be changed to fit the New Age 90s. What about androgynous hour?
But so far as Feedback's letters are concerned, that's atypical. This sort of thing is much more common.
I've enjoyed and loved Woman's Hour for more years than I can remember, but recently, under Jenny Murray, it's become a platform for the worst of feminism. Where it used to champion the wholesome, it has become obsessed with sex and the nasty.
Anne Frederick of Bournemouth's been making rather different observations about sex.
Sunday, switch on. Married priests, switch off. On again, homosexuals, off. On, lesbians, off. Couldn't there be one programme on Radio 4 which doesn't mention sex? Agony aunts get paid. I don't want to be an agony listener.
Our largest pile of letters this week was about that re-recording of the Archers' signature tune, which I discussed last week with Vanessa Whitburn, editor of the series, who said it was necessitated by the switch to stereo. John Standen of Porchester is sceptical.
That awful music was not defended very well by that yuppie editor lady. Who on earth wants stereo Archers, apart from her? Still, I was prepared to accept that somebody wanted it updated, and it didn't really interfere with any of the wonderful characterizations that we've enjoyed for so long. But the second-rate Children's Hour episode that I've just endured is too much. Are there no child actors in Birmingham? The script, presentation and editing of this edition were diabolical. I am very, very cross.
Well, yes, I can tell. 2 exclamation marks. On the subject of that signature tune, Anthony Whitehouse of Chelmsford obviously has a very long memory.
If ever a single note of the Archer's signature tune makes its way through the loudspeaker of my wireless set, my hand moves like greased lightning to the off switch. I've never forgiven this programme for supplanting its brilliant predecessor, guess what? Introduced by the magnificent Devil's Gallop.
Oh, they don't write 'em like that anymore. Doesn't it remind you of sweet coupons and Morris 8s? Dick Barton's special agent, of course. How can the Archers ever equal it? John! Snowy! Whoops, sorry, showing my age. So far as current episodes of The Archers are concerned, it's that business about the child characters which seems to be irritating a lot of you. Elizabeth Dunn of Bristol pleads.
For goodness sake, would you get these wretched children and their dreary dialogue off the air? It's so uninteresting.
And, according to Mrs. F.R. Link of Calne,
More like a Kiddywinks episode of Just William than a programme for grown-ups.
but Anne Bardsley of Chipping Norton couldn't disagree more.
I started listening to The Archers when I was 10, some 22 years ago. I began because the programme included young people, and I heartily applaud the inclusion of the exploits of children in more recent episodes, especially the dreadful Kate and the wicked but lovable William. Don't leave the children out. They're what keeps the programme alive.
Now, let's turn to a completely different subject and a different network. Charles Woodhouse of Ulster writes,
Our favourite programme of the week is Alan Keith's Your 100 Best Tunes on Radio 2. But for the last 4 weeks it's been ruined by some moronic vandal bursting into the middle with a quite unnecessary commercial in the worst possible taste.
actually a trail for a forthcoming Radio 2 programme.
When it's finished and we've recovered from the shock, we feel that Mr. Keith is almost apologising for such ill manners.
The Woodhouses are not alone. Barbara Hill of Bath declares,
I write in anger and fury at the interruptions during your 100 Best Tunes. This week it was Mud, Glorious Mud, rising from the depths of the Elgar Cello Concerto. At a concert, would someone be allowed to rush on stage and sing, or say something about what would be performed at a later date?
Miss E. May of Gillingham pleads,
Would someone please nobble the trail fiend who seems to be running wild through Broadcasting House? If the trend isn't stopped, we can expect the Daily Service, Brain of Britain and the Queen's speech to be broken into.
and read all those letters to Iain Purdon, Radio 2's planning and presentation editor, and asked what was going on.
We've changed the total presentation style of Radio 2. We used to be a combination of two approaches. During the daytime, we would run, as Radio 1 do, with programmes that completely fill their airtime and DJs who hand on one to the next. And during the evenings and the weekends, we run more as this network, Radio 4, does, with discrete articles followed by an announcement and then another programme and then an announcement, and it would be like that. Critics within Radio 4 used to describe that as the barbed wire between programmes. And we gave some thought to this and concluded, for a number of reasons, that the approach that we take during the daytime would be a more appropriate way to run the whole Radio 2 network. The flow from programme to programme is done by the programme itself, and the sort of information that we used to purvey in the gaps between the programmes now also has to take place within the body of the programme itself.
Is it that Your 100 Best Tunes might be perhaps not a particularly good type of programme to do that in? I mean, if, to take Mrs. Hill's example, if you get Mud, Glorious Mud coming up in the middle of the Elgar Cello Concerto, that does sound somewhat inappropriate.
The Alan Keith programme make, if you like, their own lead in and out of these items, and the way they have been doing it is to allow a piece of music to finish and then the trailer goes in immediately after that. They're going to change that. They will come up at the end of the piece of music, say what it was, and then the trailer will go in. It's a minor point, but I suspect it will avoid the sort of
But
culture.
her precise objection will in fact be met, you're saying?
Well, the culture shock of having Elgar followed by
Flanders and Swan.
Flanders and Swan or Ian Wallace or whatever, will go. They won't get that juxtaposition. But the material will still be there.
What about the other point made by several people that it seems almost an insult to the presenter that Alan Keith himself, seems apologetic about it?
Well, I think it's really a matter for Alan Keith and his producer to consider. We've actually given them two ways in which they can do it. Either we can provide them, as we are doing, with a complete produced trail, or Alan Keith himself can tell his listeners about other things that are happening on Radio 2 during the coming week. They've chosen to do it the former way, but there's no reason on reflection, and we do talk about these things a lot, why we couldn't move to the other way of doing it.
Your 100 Best Tunes isn't the only place that listeners have been noticing an increase in trails, nor is Radio 2 the only network. H.W. Ashton of Shotton writes,
On Wednesday on Radio 4 there was a delightful programme concerning the contrabassoon. At its conclusion at 8 o'clock I was astounded to hear the continuity announcer virtually advising listeners to abandon Radio 4 because at 8:15 one could watch a very good programme on BBC 2. What sort of idiocy is this? Does one baked bean producer advise people to eat a rival's product?
Philip Henman of New Malden inquires,
Has BBC Radio got a death wish? If not, why are television programmes advertised on radio? Are radio programmes advertised on television?
Simon Field of Horsham asks,
Please could you find out why Radio 4 has taken to advertising television programmes? I find it extremely annoying. If I wanted to listen to adverts, I'd tune into commercial radio.
I asked Iain Purdon whether television did do as much for radio as radio does for television.
I think the balance is probably tipped more on the radio side, in that it's much easier for us in the context, particularly of a Radio 2 programme, to chuck in a mention of a programme on television tonight, and it's effortless and you can do it quite quickly. So yes, we do more. But television do provide the quid pro quo in a rather different way, in that they give a certain limited amount of airtime, much less than they do to television programmes, but nevertheless some, to making glossy trailers for radio network output.
If we wanted to listen to programmes with interruptions, we'd listen to commercial broadcasting.
Well, where do you draw the line? I mean, if we don't tell people about other things that we're doing, I think we're missing a trick, because not everybody buys the Listings magazine. Some people look in the papers, but we did some research recently to find out where most people find out about Radio 2 programmes. We weren't asking the question about television. And the vast majority get it from our own airwaves.
Certainly, so far as Radio 4 network is concerned, listeners have got the impression there's been a lot more of this recently. Has there been a lot more on Radio 2 as well? Are you doing more promotion for television than you used to?
We certainly are. We're probably doing more than anyone else, partly because it is so easy for us to do, and partly because we believe it's the right thing to do.
Iain Purdon. Last week's detailed letter about the future of the BBC, come the government's review and the charter renewal, has resulted in some interesting reactions. Timothy Cheevers of Tunbridge Wells says,
I must protest at your correspondents who have already decided the fate of the BBC. They seem to be totally self-centred. The BBC can only survive if it appeals to a broad base of the population. I listen to Radio 4 throughout the day and Radio 1 in the evening and on Saturday afternoons. I'm advised that the Radio 1 audience could be catered for by the commercial sector. Yesterday I listened to a 90-minute live concert by Bruce Springsteen on that station. I had no interruptions advising me to go to XYZ Do-It-Yourself store or buy ABC beer, and that's how I like my music. Who is to decide what music should be free of commercials? Are only classical works worthy of this? What these culture buffs don't realise is that if they get their way, they will lose. Why should the majority pay a licence fee to satisfy a small minority?
Mrs. J.D. Morgan says,
I was totally exasperated by your correspondent who wrote about the iniquity of radios 1, 2 and so on being subsidised by the taxpayer. Here in London, I have a wide choice of commercial stations, none of which I choose to listen to, but all of which I pay for every time I go shopping and buy a product advertised on television or radio. As a family of 4, I bet we pay much more in this hidden levy than we do in the licence fee. I wonder if anyone has ever quantified by how much advertising puts up the average grocery bill.
Yes, they have, and on some products, advertising and promotion accounts for as much as 30% of the price paid by the consumer. Moreover, commercial television programmes certainly cost more to produce on average than BBC programmes, though I've never seen similar comparisons for radio. I suspect the reverse is true in radio, where there's a much greater contrast in content. Finally, Richard Dobson of Southend-on-Sea writes to ask,
have you noticed the irritating trend towards irrelevant inclusion, in broadcasts on all subjects, of references to the contributors' children? For instance, question, do you think, Professor, that the latest cosmology research programme will weaken or strengthen the theories on extraterrestrial life forms? Answer, it's strange you should ask that. Only the other morning my 5-year-old daughter Fiona came into my study and said, Daddy, is there really a man in the moon? She's a very bright little lady, as well as being pretty. She has her mother's blue eyes, you know, and I can tell you, I had to think pretty darn carefully before answering. As a working label, I have named this habit the little kiddie wink syndrome. I suggest a new rule. Unless the subject of the programme happens to be my wonderful children, the temptation to talk about them should be resisted.
Thank you for that and all your letters. Do keep writing.
Feedback was presented by Chris Dunkley of the Financial Times. The producer was Nadine Grieve. And the address for your letters is Feedback, BBC Broadcasting House, London W1A 1AA.